A bizarre twist to the disappearance of Dr. Alan Canty.
I walked into his home office, frantic. I looked in the mirror and I said out loud, "He's not coming home."
Her husband's hidden urges have led him down a dark path.
He was supposed to be a respected psychologist while he was actually feeding drugs to a young prostitute.
She said, "Wait a minute, I don't even know who my husband is anymore."
"20-year-old Jan Canty gets accepted into nearby Wayne State University. Now, she just has to figure out a way to pay for school.
I arrived at Wayne State around 1972, approximately. It was exhilarating. I loved it. I was challenged.
In search of a job to help pay tuition, Jan is given the name of respected psychologist Dr. Alan Canty.
I walked into Al's office, and it wasn't at all what I expected. He didn't have a suit on even. Didn't make good eye contact, kind of bumbling, but smiling and encouraging.
Jan goes to work for Alan and finds herself intrigued by the enigmatic psychologist. When he asks her out on a date, she says yes. The first date leads to a budding relationship based on shared academic interests.
I fell in love with him because of the kind of person I viewed him to be. And I felt lucky to be with him and very confident that we were going to make it. We were out for breakfast one morning, and I asked him to marry me because I got to thinking, he's so shy and awkward, he'll never get around to the point. So I better do it. I had a paper calendar on me, and I had a fork in my right hand and the calendar in my left hand. I just stuck it on a date, and it was a Saturday, and I said, "How about that?" And he goes, "Okay." So we did.
Flush with wealth and status she never really craved, Jan is surprised when the support she desires from Alan starts to fade.
He liked to be in the role where you needed him. As Jan matured and learned more about psychology, he was adrift. She no longer needed him the way she had early in the relationship.
I felt we were drifting apart. I didn't know why.
Over the next year, Alan becomes even more withdrawn and focused on his work. But Alan refuses to slow down. And then, in April 1984, Jan gets a frantic phone call.
His mother would call him at work, and he'd pick up and hang up. He wouldn't talk. And this happened multiple times within an hour. So she asked me to go downtown and see what was up. The office was unlocked. I walked in. All the lights were off. He was sitting in his chair and kind of mumbling at times, but real soft. He was saying, "Snow, I've been bad. Am I a good boy? Am I standing tall? Birthday, Cass." Just this jumble. So I called my mentor at the medical center, and I asked him if I could bring Al in. I said, "I don't know what's going on." They did some blood work and agreed with me he was having a psychotic break. I mean, we'd been together 10 years, almost 11 at that point. I had never seen him like that. I had never seen anybody like that.
But as Jan digs deeper, she starts uncovering things that are not so easy to explain.
I found out that the admitting psychiatrist and his mother talked separately without me around, and he had been hospitalized twice before, psychiatrically.
Alan's previous breakdowns had been triggered by major life events, prompting Jan to question the cause of this one.
So I made it a project of mine to go to his office and to straighten it up. I found a receipt with my forged name on an account paying rent for some person I had never heard of. Then I found unpaid bills. I totaled it up, and it came to $6,000, which is in 1985 dollars. I went to his appointment book, and he had all these names that he had written in. And they were made-up names. They were silly names, like Peter Pan and Willie the Goose. And I'm like, and it was his handwriting.
After 6 weeks of uncovering evidence that suggests Alan is suffering from mental illness, Jan picks her husband up from the hospital.
He was real quiet. I told him I started cleaning up his office. I wasn't ready yet to get into what I'd found. Well, what do you mean you were cleaning up the office? I said it was a pigsty. He was incensed. He wouldn't talk the rest of the way.
When he left in the morning, he was dressed a little different. He looked like a person that was determined and sure as to what he was doing.
That day was awful. High winds, rain, hail, sleet, in the middle of summer. So I lost track of time, and I look up, and all of a sudden it's like, he's way overdue. He was never one to be late. I'm like, that's odd. So I called his office. His answering service said they had no information. I was frantic. The storm was raging. There was lightning. It was awful outside. And I walked into his home office. I looked in the mirror, and I said out loud, he's not coming home. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went down to the police to report him missing.
The very first year of the investigation, I went to the Fisher building. I'm saying to myself, if a person is overworked as he is, how does he relax if he's not home, if he's always working? A person must find something to unwind with. And I happened to look outside and I saw that 2nd Avenue and going south goes right towards Cass Quarter.
This sort of no man's land where there's a lot of empty lots, skid row hotels, tenement housing, hookers on the street, dope fiends.
So I went over there, and I was very fortunate that I ran into a couple of my informants. One of them was Susie Q. She says, there's a guy that's driving around, and when he saw us, he would always ask, have you seen Dawn? Have you seen Dawn? I said, Dawn who? And she says, Dawn Spence. Susie Q told me that John Fry was Dawn's pimp. Well, I says, where can I find John? She says, I want you to be very careful. John's very violent. And I said, well, does he carry a gun? And she says, he doesn't need a gun.
The next day, Detective Osowski's informant calls him with startling news.
She said, I heard on the street that maybe Dr. Candy's car was toasted already, which means arson.
Police get a search warrant for the Casper Street location where John Fry and Dawn Spence live and find evidence pointing to a crime scene. After they process the location, reporter Tiwa Chang gets a tip about the case.
I went to the back door. The back door was open, and it was a surreal scene. The house was a mess, and then I saw a blood trail from the bedroom that went all the way to the bathroom. But then I see blood in the bathtub, little specks of blood, because someone had apparently tried to wash it. And there was a search warrant that had all the basics of the story. The missing psychologist, Dr. Alan Canty, suspect they were looking for, John Fry, and a prostitute named Dawn Spence.
6 days after Dr. Alan Canty is reported missing, lead investigator Marlise Landeros gets a surprise visit from an informant named Frank McMaster.
Frank McMasters, who's this trucker up in northern Michigan, who knows John Lucky Fry. And he and Dawn come in and says, Frank, I gotta get rid of something. So they go back on this old logging trail, and Lucky's got this bag. Lucky admits to Frank, he says, you know, I killed somebody last night. And Frank digs this hole, and Lucky takes the bag and drops it in the hole and goes, bye-bye, Al.
Less than 24 hours later, Jan is called down to the morgue.
So we got to the morgue, and it reeked in there. And then we walk into the chamber, and I closed my eyes. My dad on one side, Detective Landeros was on the other side. And so I opened my eyes, and I saw what I saw. A head, his head, on a table, with a sheet wrapped around its neck.
Early on the morning of July 22nd, there's a break in the case.
Fry and Spence were arrested just after midnight in front of this house in northwest Detroit. Fry's aunt lives here. They were arrested by a next-door neighbor who's a policeman.
Lucky Fry's trial is held on December 3rd, 1985.
It was probably one of the most crowded trials I've ever been to. I got in the front row, and then I was able to, get a close-up look at Dawn Spence. Dawn Spence had this wounded bird quality. It's more than just a damsel in distress. It's more like a siren in distress.
As the trial moves forward, the extent of Alan's obsession with the young prostitute becomes clear. He paid regular visits to Dawn Spence for over 1.5 years.
The question that has puzzled police from the outset of the investigation is why would Spence and Fry kill the man who reportedly over the last 1.5 years had given them as much as $150,000 for what police describe as a social relationship that included sexual favors. Why, one policeman asked, why would they kill the goose that laid the golden egg?
Dawn has become an addiction for Alan. Even though he hasn't been using drugs himself, he's drained his bank accounts to fund her habit.
His plan that evening was that was going to be the last night, that he wasn't going to see them anymore. Meanwhile, Lucky Fry's got another plan going, and that is, okay, Al, you're going to give me $5,000, $10,000, $20,000. We're not quite sure what the amount was. And I'm going to leave Dawn to you, and I get that and a plane ticket to Venice, California, and live. So Al leaves the Fisher Building at 6:35, and he goes over to see Dawn and Lucky on the southwest side, the bungalow on Casper. And Dawn wants drugs, so he buys drugs for her. According to Lucky, he came home and saw what was going on. And he said, can't you see we're trying to get clean? And now you're buying her more drugs? And Al said, it's my money. I don't have to justify anything I do to you, and pushed him out of the way. Nobody laid hands on Lucky Fry. If you laid hands on him, he would explode into a rage. John picked up the baseball bat that happened to be there and hit him on the head. And even after Al fell down, he screamed at him, get up, motherfucker, get up. Lucky doesn't want to get any blood on his clothes, and he ends up naked in the bathtub with Al and dismembers him. He puts him in garbage bags. They get in the car and they head to northern Michigan, where Lucky's former girlfriend is living with this guy, Frank McMasters.
At the end of Fry's trial on December 11th, it takes the all-female jury less than 2 hours to decide his fate.
51-year-old John Fry was found guilty of beating Dr. Alan Canty to death with a baseball bat, then cutting the doctor's body into pieces.
Fry was sentenced to life in prison for the killing. He will never be eligible for parole, ever.
5 days later, in a separate trial, Dawn Spence is found guilty of being an accessory after the murder.
The judge went easy on Spence. She could have gotten 5 years in jail. Instead, she got 10 months in jail with 3 years probation.
I'm glad she didn't go to prison. She's a participant, but also a victim. The fact that she went to rehab, and I've heard that she's, turned her life around, so I guess it turned out to be the right decision.
My life is very different now. After 30 years of trying to piece it all together and make sense of it, I adopted 2 daughters. It was a new role as a mom, and it gave me new purpose. Then I met Rich and let him in slowly. It was very much at arm's length. And I'm trying to take all that I've learned and use it to the benefit of other homicide survivors, because there is still so few resources out there and so little understanding of what people go through.